Thanks, JJ, and thanks to ECA for having me here. It's always lovely to come back and see so many familiar faces. So what I'm really keen to have a chat to you all about today is some work my colleague Ben and I have been doing around consumer engagement. And so we've been going to a lot of forums across the telecommunications, banking and energy sectors where surprisingly similar conversations are happening around trust and about whether people can make meaningful choices about the products that they are attempting to acquire. We started to think about, well, what are the actual underlying settings or preconditions that need to be present for consumer engagement to actually be meaningful and effective, and for consumers to be able to acquire products that genuinely suit their needs. And I think everyone here today, and I've heard it sort of mentioned in a variety of different guises, agrees probably that a lot of these sectors have had a very heavy supply side focus for many years. We've been talking about efficiency, we've been talking about building stuff, we've been talking about electrification. But I think what we're seeing now globally and also happily within the Australian market is a trend towards having a look at the demand side and what is actually going on for consumers when they're engaging within these markets. And the fields of behavioural economics and psychology have shown that more information provision is not the panacea. It doesn't necessarily result in better outcomes. So when we think about consumer engagement, we think about simply the interactions between a consumer and information and a market in order to acquire a product. So engagement, just in any form of life, can be good and it can be bad. There can be good and bad outcomes from engagement. The question is how it happens and whether it's meaningful. So I guess, more engagement to us is not the solution. It's a question about whether we can achieve better engagement and better outcomes. And so what we've developed is really a framework for thinking about policy and regulatory interventions within this context. And it's really trying to focus a lot more on what outcomes are we actually trying to achieve when we're attempting policy and regulatory intervention. And I guess it really applies wherever a consumer is needing to make a choice between two products or providers or more. Really, within the policy and regulatory toolbox, there's a spectrum of interventions, everything ranging from information provision and education right through to environmental restructuring or modelling or, in some terms, and what Jared mentioned earlier, product restriction. So I guess there is a spectrum of different interventions. There's not a one-size-fits-all, really, depending on the market and depending on the circumstance. So the first precondition I guess we really have landed on is around barriers for vulnerable customers. So if consumer engagement is to be effective, then barriers to access really need to be removed. And this can be done through some of the outreach programs, just as Janine had mentioned earlier, so education and information provision, connecting with known vulnerable groups, and that actually being tailored to the vulnerability being experienced. The QCOS Switched On Communities program is another really good example of this, where they went out and engaged with groups that were specifically experiencing disability. It might be from CALD backgrounds or financial hardship, and having tailored education and intervention strategies which actually go to those vulnerable groups and support them engage with products and services in the marketplace. Other sorts of things that might fit in with ensuring vulnerable customers acquire products that suit their needs are things like product feature restrictions, and that's where you can start to talk about things like late fees, maybe not being as appropriate for vulnerable customers with financial difficulty, or paper billing fees being removed, or right through to things like product restriction, where certain products may actually not be suitable for vulnerable customers, and therefore, there may be cause to potentially restrict those products going to vulnerable customers. The second precondition we look at is around information, and this is about information of the product that needs to be clear and comprehensible. No longer is it good enough just to say give people more information. And what we're seeing internationally is a move towards comprehension testing. So when we actually provide information about a product to a consumer, doing consumer research to see whether they actually comprehend that information or not. And this really goes to things like removal of jargon. There's a lot of industry jargon that we all talk in this room. On the street, it means little to nothing. My favourite particular piece of industry jargon at the moment is controlled load. I'm sure you've probably all got your favourites as well. But really thinking about what is the particular language that's being used and what meaning does it actually have to consumers when they engage with that information. Similarly, as Ian mentioned, the role of service and quality information, but also the presentation of price information. We can look at how we can better present price information in a meaningful and comparable way. The third component is around comparison, and so I guess this is making sure consumers can compare the products and services that are presented to them, and the information that we decide is really important. We have advocated a platform neutral approach here, so this is having a look at really going to where consumers compare this information. It could be on retailer websites, it could be on government comparator websites, it could be on commercial comparator websites. But ultimately, that information should be consistent, it should be easy, it should be accurate to access for consumers. The fourth component is around switching, so making sure that switching costs are actually low. And when we talk about switching costs, we're talking about both financial costs, so things like exit fees, but also time costs. So if you have to fill out a 12-page form to actually perform the switch, then that's not a particularly good process for anyone either, and fundamentally is a barrier. There's a big role for data portability, I think, in this space, with a bunch of caveats around appropriate protections, but also the enablement of new market entrants who can potentially act as, concierge services on behalf of a consumer. So some really innovative and some new exciting stuff, I think, that could make a difference here. The fifth component is around awareness. So we can build the best price fact sheets, the best comparator websites in the world. If no one knows that they exist, then their efficacy is obviously quite limited. So this is where you think about things like broad-based advertising campaigns, or it could be nudges at particular points in the decision-making process for consumers. We know consumers engage with their bill and look for other offers. They are more likely to look for other offers when they receive their bill. So thinking about how we could actually include nudges and information when it's relevant to the consumer to get them to engage with the market. So we kind of, are trying to highlight that this process really does need to be integrated. We can't just have, a panacea, of a one-size-fits-all. We do have to take, a meaningful approach to engagement, and probably echoing some of Larissa's comments earlier, it needs to be based on the lived experience of consumers. So what's actually happening in reality, not what we think is going to happen in theory. So that's probably it from me.